How did one man manage to stand against both Hitler and Stalin, yet maintain Yugoslavia's unity for decades without bowing to either superpower during the Cold War? This is not merely a question of historical curiosity, but a profound inquiry into the nature of power, independence, and survival in an era when the world was divided into rigid ideological camps that demanded absolute loyalty. Josip Broz Tito was more than a leader. He was a master strategist of autonomy in an era defined by brutal pressure, impossible choices, and the constant threat of annihilation for those who dared to chart their own course. In this comprehensive exploration, we will uncover how he challenged the world's greatest superpowers, led a legendary resistance movement against Nazi occupation that ranks among the most effective in European history, and forged a political model that baffled even the most brilliant strategic minds of the 20th century. His story is one of calculated defiance, tactical brilliance, and an unwavering commitment to independence that would reshape the geopolitical landscape of Europe and inspire liberation movements across the developing world. If you've ever wondered to what extent true independence is possible in a world dominated by forced alliances, competing global interests, and the overwhelming pressure to conform to one ideological camp or another, this exploration will provide profound insights into the mechanisms of power, the art of political survival, and the complex calculations required to maintain sovereignty when caught between empires. We will delve deep into the decisions that shaped a multi-ethnic nation, explore the behind-the-scenes machinations of power that kept Yugoslavia balanced on a knife's edge, and understand how Tito became an enduring symbol of strength and self-determination, even amid the chaos of ideological warfare, total conflict, and the ever-present threat of invasion from either east or west. Consider this provocative question that cuts to the heart of political strategy and moral choice. If you were in his position, facing pressures from both superpowers, dealing with ancient ethnic hatreds, and trying to build a new society from the ruins of war, would you choose the precarious path of neutrality that offered independence but also isolation and danger? Or would you align with one superpower to ensure survival, even if it meant surrendering the sovereignty and vision you had fought for? Was the unity he constructed through a combination of ideology, force, and personal charisma capable of withstanding the test of time? Or was it merely a political time bomb waiting to explode the moment his iron grip loosened? Stay with us until the end, because Tito's extraordinary journey may reveal more about leadership, strategic thinking, diplomatic maneuvering, and making difficult decisions under extreme pressure than any theoretical textbook on political science, international relations, or revolutionary theory ever could. Josip Broz was born on May 7, 1892, in Kumrovec, a small rural village located in northern Croatia near the border with Slovenia, which at that time formed part of the vast and increasingly unstable Austro-Hungarian Empire. This multinational empire, one of the great powers of Europe, stretched from the Alps to the Carpathian Mountains and encompassed a bewildering variety of ethnic groups, languages, religions, and cultures that were held together by the Habsburg monarchy and an intricate bureaucratic apparatus. His family belonged to the peasant class, with mixed Croatian and Slovenian heritage that reflected the ethnic complexity of the border region where they lived. They existed in modest circumstances that were typical of the overwhelming majority of the population throughout the Balkans during that era, a time when industrialization had barely touched rural areas and traditional agricultural methods remained dominant. Daily life for the Broz family was characterized by arduous agricultural labor from dawn to dusk, a rigid social hierarchy that offered little hope of advancement, and extremely limited opportunities for social mobility or economic improvement that might lift them from their humble status. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, despite its grandeur and claims to civilizing mission, was a multinational conglomerate of diverse ethnic groups and cultures that was beginning to show serious cracks in its imperial structure as nationalist movements gained strength across its territories. Within this complex and often oppressive context, the Broz family, like countless other peasant families scattered across the empire's vast domains, struggled daily to maintain basic subsistence while navigating the intricacies of imperial rule, simmering ethnic tensions between different communities, and persistent economic hardship that kept them perpetually on the edge of poverty. Young Josip grew up witnessing firsthand the inequalities and injustices that characterized the empire's treatment of its peasant population, particularly those from Slavic backgrounds who were often viewed as second-class subjects compared to the German and Hungarian elites who dominated the imperial administration. These experiences of discrimination, poverty, and powerlessness would profoundly shape his worldview and future political consciousness, planting the seeds of rebellion that would later flower into revolutionary commitment. The village of Kumrovec, though small and isolated, was not immune to the larger forces transforming Europe. Ideas of nationalism, socialism, and revolution were beginning to penetrate even into remote rural areas through migrant workers, soldiers returning from military service, and the occasional radical pamphlet. From an early age, Josip demonstrated considerable manual dexterity and mechanical aptitude that set him apart from his peers and suggested a future beyond agricultural labor. His hands seemed naturally suited to working with tools and machinery, and he possessed an intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems functioned. Recognizing these talents and the potential they offered for a better life, his family made the significant decision to send him to Zagreb, the Croatian capital, to learn the metalworking trade. This was no small sacrifice for a peasant family, as it meant losing his labor on the farm and scraping together funds for his apprenticeship and living expenses in the city. In Zagreb, he apprenticed in various mechanical workshops and industrial facilities where he learned to work with metal, operate machinery, and understand the basics of industrial production. This transition from rural agricultural life to urban industrial work proved utterly transformative, exposing him to the profound technological and social changes that were reshaping Europe at the turn of the 20th century. The contrast between the timeless rhythms of peasant life and the mechanized tempo of industrial production was stark and revelatory. He was witnessing and participating in the great transformation that was creating the modern world. Even as that transformation came at a terrible human cost for workers like himself. As a metalworker and skilled craftsman employed in various Zagreb workshops, he gained direct exposure to the urban working-class environment, a world utterly different from the village where he had grown up. This was a world characterized by long hours in dangerous conditions, strikes that erupted when workers' patience reached its limit, emerging labor unions that attempted to organize workers for collective action, and the socialist ideas that were gaining considerable momentum among industrial workers across Europe, who saw in them the promise of dignity, justice, and a better future. The workshops where he labored became crucibles of political consciousness, spaces where discussions of workers' rights, economic exploitation, the nature of capitalism, and the possibility of social revolution were commonplace despite official prohibitions and the ever-present threat of state repression. Factory floors, taverns where workers gathered after shifts, and clandestine meeting rooms became informal schools of politics where young workers like Broz learned to think critically about the society they lived in and to imagine alternatives to the existing order. He absorbed these conversations eagerly, his sharp mind grasping the connections between abstract political theory and the concrete realities of his daily experience. Still in his youth, bursting with energy and curiosity about the wider world, Tito became what was known as an itinerant worker, a common phenomenon among the skilled laborers of the period who sought better wages, improved working conditions, and new experiences across borders that were relatively open in the pre-war era. He traveled extensively through various cities within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, working in workshops in Vienna, Budapest, and other industrial centers, and he even ventured beyond the empire's borders into other countries, including Germany and what is now the Czech Republic, accumulating experiences and perspectives that few of his contemporaries from similar backgrounds could match. This peripatetic existence, though often difficult and uncertain, broadened his perspective significantly and brought him into direct contact with diverse working-class cultures, each with its own particular traditions of resistance, solidarity, and political organization developed through decades of struggle. In German workshops, he encountered the highly organized socialist movement with its mass parties and trade unions. In Czech factories, he He witnessed the intertwining of national and class consciousness as workers fought both for political rights and national autonomy. Each location added new layers to his understanding of the workers, movement, and the possibilities for social transformation. In each workshop and factory where he found employment, often staying for months before moving on, he absorbed new ideas, observed recurring patterns of inequality and exploitation that seemed to characterize industrial capitalism regardless of location, and came to understand the reality of a transnational proletariat in full ferment. He witnessed how workers across different nations and ethnicities, speaking different languages and practicing different customs, nonetheless faced remarkably similar struggles against capital and authority. The bosses might be German, Hungarian, or Italian, but their relationship to workers followed the same logic of exploitation everywhere. These experiences were invaluable, providing him with a cosmopolitan perspective that was rare among workers of his modest background, and establishing connections and networks across borders that would later prove crucial to his political career and revolutionary activities. He was building what would later be called social capital, relationships, knowledge of different regions and languages, and an understanding of how to navigate different political and cultural contexts. He learned to speak German fluently, picked up some Czech and improved his command of the various South Slavic languages, skills that would serve him well in his later organizing work. During this formative period of wandering and learning, Marxism was gaining significant ground as the dominant ideology among workers throughout Central and Eastern Europe, offering a comprehensive explanation for their suffering and a vision of liberation. The Russian Revolution of 1905, though ultimately unsuccessful in overthrowing the Tsarist regime, had left important marks on the political consciousness of the working class across the continent, demonstrating that workers could challenge even the most powerful autocratic states. The ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the founding fathers of scientific socialism, circulated widely in pamphlets and clandestine workers' newspapers, often passed hand to hand in factories and meeting halls by activists who risked arrest and imprisonment for their efforts. These texts explained how capitalism functioned as a system, how surplus value was extracted from workers' labor, and how the contradictions of the capitalist system would eventually lead to its overthrow and replacement by a socialist society based on common ownership and democratic planning. Josip Broz read these texts with growing interest and intellectual hunger, often staying up late after exhausting shifts to study by candlelight. Marx's Capital, Engels's The Condition of the Working Class in England, and various other socialist writings opened his eyes to the systemic nature of the exploitation he experienced. This wasn't just bad luck or cruel bosses, it was the inevitable result of a system based on private ownership of the means of production and the extraction of profit from workers' labor. Simultaneously, he was experiencing firsthand the exploitation and abuses that characterized factory life under industrial capitalism. The long hours that left workers exhausted, the dangerous conditions that led to frequent injuries and deaths, the arbitrary authority of foremen and managers, the periodic unemployment when economic downturns led to mass layoffs, and the wages that barely allowed survival, let alone any hope of advancement or security. The gap between the promises of liberal progress and the reality of working-class existence became increasingly apparent to him. He saw how the wealth generated by workers' labor, the magnificent products of industry that were transforming society, enriched factory owners and aristocrats who lived in luxury, while those who actually produced that wealth struggled to feed their families and lived in overcrowded slums without adequate sanitation or basic amenities. This direct experience of class exploitation, combined with his exposure to Marxist theory that explained the underlying mechanisms, laid the foundation for his revolutionary commitment and his understanding of the absolute necessity for fundamental social transformation. He became convinced that reform was insufficient. Only revolution could create a just society. In 1913, on the eve of the First World War that would devastate Europe and destroy the old imperial order, Josip Broz was conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army, as were millions of other young men across the empire who would serve as cannon fodder in the coming catastrophe. Military service was compulsory for all able-bodied males, and the empire's diverse population was expected to fight for a state that many of them felt little loyalty toward. He served initially in the 25th Infantry Regiment in Zagreb, undergoing the harsh training regimen designed to transform civilians into soldiers who would obey orders without question. He was subsequently transferred to units stationed in Bosnia, a region that had been occupied by Austria-Hungary in 1878 and formally annexed in 1908, provoking intense anger among Serbian nationalists who viewed Bosnia as part of the Serbian national territory. This was a region marked by intense national tensions and ethnic rivalries between Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslim Bosniaks that would eventually contribute to the outbreak of the Great War following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist in June 1914. When the conflict erupted in August 1914, following a cascade of mobilizations and declarations of war among the European powers, Tito was deployed to the Eastern Front to fight against the Russian Empire as part of the empire's desperate effort to maintain control of its eastern territories and prevent Russian expansion into Central Europe. The Eastern Front was a vast theater of war stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, where millions of soldiers would die in brutal fighting characterized by massive offensives, chaotic retreats, and suffering on an unimaginable scale. In 1915, during a major offensive operation in the Carpathian Mountains, where Austro-Hungarian forces were attempting to break through Russian lines, he was severely wounded in combat when a Russian lance pierced his back, nearly killing him. He was subsequently captured by Russian troops and became one of hundreds of thousands of prisoners taken during the grinding battles of the Eastern Front. This moment, though traumatic and terrifying, would prove to be a crucial turning point in his life and political development, redirecting his path from that of an ordinary soldier to that of a revolutionary. As a prisoner of war, Broz was transported under harsh conditions to a concentration camp deep in Siberia, that vast frozen expanse of Russia that had served as a place of exile and punishment for centuries. There he would spend years enduring extreme conditions of cold that could reach 50 degrees below zero in winter, chronic scarcity of food that left prisoners perpetually hungry and weakened, disease that swept through the camps, killing thousands, and profound isolation from the world they had known. The Siberian camps were notorious for their harsh treatment of prisoners, and survival itself was a daily struggle against the elements, deprivation, and despair. Despite the immense difficulties and suffering that tested the limits of human endurance, this experience proved transformative in ways that would have been impossible to predict. The environment of captivity, paradoxically, brought him into contact with a remarkable cross-section of individuals: deserters who had fled from the Tsarist army, revolutionaries who had been imprisoned for political activities before the war, and dissident intellectuals who had been exiled to Siberia for their opposition to the regime. These men debated intensely about the profound changes that were brewing in Russia and across Europe, as the old order crumbled under the weight of military catastrophe. Many of these prisoners actively disseminated socialist and anti-war ideas, creating a political microcosm filled with intellectual ferment and revolutionary discussion that stood in stark contrast to the physical deprivation of camp life. For Broz, who had already been exposed to Marxist ideas during his years as an industrial worker, this concentration of radical thinkers provided an intensive education in revolutionary theory and practice far beyond what he could have obtained through reading alone. Here were men who had participated in the Revolution of 1905, who had organized strikes and demonstrations, who had studied Marx and Lenin in depth, and who could explain the complexities of revolutionary strategy and tactics. In 1917, he became a direct witness to the Russian Revolution, experiencing firsthand one of the most momentous events in human history. First came the February Revolution and the fall of Tsarism, when the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty collapsed under the combined weight of military defeat, economic crisis, and popular revolt. The Tsar, who had ruled as an absolute monarch claiming divine right, was forced to abdicate, and a provisional government was established promising political reforms and continued prosecution of the war. Then came the October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power with the promise of peace, land, and bread for Russia's suffering masses. The impact of this revolutionary process was enormous among the foreign prisoners, many of whom saw in the revolution the possibility of a new world order based on socialist principles and workers' power rather than capitalist exploitation and imperial domination. The Bolsheviks proclaimed the end of Russian participation in the imperialist war, the nationalization of land and major industries, and the establishment of a workers' state that would serve as a beacon for revolutionaries worldwide. Tito was no exception to this revolutionary enthusiasm that swept through the prison camps. He found himself immersed in a historic moment that promised to change the world fundamentally. And rather than remaining a passive spectator to these epochal events, he actively sought to become involved in the revolutionary process. The Russian Revolution seemed to validate everything the Marxist texts had predicted, that the working class could seize power, that capitalism could be overthrown, that a new socialist society was possible. After escaping from the prisoner camp with assistance from Russian revolutionaries, who recognized his commitment and abilities, he began living in various cities, including Omsk, in Siberia, and Petrograd, the revolutionary capital where the Bolsheviks had seized power. In these cities, he worked in factories to support himself while drawing closer to Bolshevik circles and revolutionary organizations that were working to consolidate the new Soviet government against internal and external enemies. During this extraordinary period of revolutionary transformation and civil war, Tito also participated in specific actions of the Red Guard, the armed workers, militias that had played a crucial role in the Bolshevik seizure of power and were now fighting to defend the revolution against the White Armies and foreign intervention. He collaborated with the Bolsheviks in logistical tasks, defense operations against counter-revolutionary forces, and efforts to consolidate revolutionary power in various regions. Although he did not occupy formal leadership positions in the Bolshevik hierarchy, he was after all a foreigner with limited Russian and no established position in the party. This involvement connected him directly with the mechanisms of Soviet political transformation. He witnessed the establishment of the Cheka, the secret police, the implementation of war communism with its requisitioning of grain, the fierce debates within the Bolshevik party about strategy and tactics, and the ruthless determination with which the Bolsheviks suppressed opposition and consolidated their monopoly on power. This provided him with invaluable practical experience in revolutionary organization, armed struggle, and the exercise of power that would prove enormously useful in his later career. He learned that revolutions required not just idealistic enthusiasm, but also discipline, organization, willingness to use force, and sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. When Josip Broz finally returned to the Balkans in 1920, after years of war, captivity, and revolutionary activity in Russia, he encountered a political landscape that was both turbulent and increasingly repressive. The newly created monarchy of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which would later be renamed Yugoslavia in 1929, was attempting to consolidate centralized power under a Serbian-dominated monarchy while suppressing all forms of dissent and opposition that might threaten the fragile unity of this artificial state, cobbled together from the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. The new kingdom brought together peoples with different languages, religions, historical experiences, and political aspirations under a single crown, and tensions between Serbs who dominated the state apparatus, Croats who resented Serbian dominance, and other ethnic groups were already evident. In this volatile context, workers' and peasants' movements that demanded social and economic reforms were viewed with deep suspicion and hostility by the authorities, especially in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, which had sent shockwaves through ruling classes across Europe, who feared that revolutionary contagion might spread to their own countries. Broz quickly became involved in union organizing and communist political work. Drawing on his experiences in Russia and his understanding of revolutionary tactics developed during his years abroad, his ability to communicate effectively with workers, his background as an industrial laborer that gave him credibility and legitimacy among the working class eye, and his knowledge of Marxist theory made him a valuable organizer. He participated not only in strikes and labor actions aimed at improving wages and working conditions, but also in broader initiatives aimed at raising political consciousness among workers, utilizing clandestine newspapers and pamphlets to disseminate Marxist ideas and organize resistance to the monarchist regime. He rapidly distinguished himself through his capacity to link practical demands related to wages, working conditions, hours, and labor rights with broader revolutionary ideals and the vision of a socialist transformation of society that would liberate workers from exploitation. This ability to connect immediate struggles with long-term goals to show workers that their daily battles in the workplace were part of a larger struggle for a fundamentally different society caught the attention of the leadership of the clandestine Communist Party of Yugoslavia. The Communist Party had been banned in 1921 following a series of strikes, demonstrations, and political actions that had alarmed the authorities, and many of its leaders were imprisoned or forced into exile abroad, where they attempted to direct the party's activities from afar. This made militant activity extremely dangerous and required tremendous discipline, dedication, and sophisticated conspiratorial practices to avoid detection by the police, who maintained extensive networks of informers and conducted regular raids on suspected communist meeting places. Beyond his union work in industrial centers, Broz expanded his militancy into the peasant sphere, especially in the peripheral regions of the Federation, where rural poverty, land hunger, and resentment against landlords and the state created significant revolutionary potential. He sought to unite industrial workers and agricultural laborers in a single revolutionary project, an approach that was relatively uncommon within the Yugoslav left of the period, which often focused exclusively on urban industrial workers and ignored or dismissed the revolutionary potential of the peasantry. This attention to the peasantry reflected his own background and his understanding, derived partly from the Russian experience, that in a largely agricultural country like Yugoslavia, any successful revolution would require peasant support or at least peasant neutrality. He traveled extensively through rural areas, attending village gatherings, talking with peasants about their grievances, and explaining how communist policies of land redistribution and the abolition of debt would benefit them. He also began utilizing multiple false identities and aliases, moving between cities and regions under different names with forged documents, which made his capture by police authorities significantly more difficult. This practice of assuming different identities became so ingrained that even decades later, after he had become the undisputed leader of Yugoslavia, mysteries and uncertainties would surround various periods of his life. The name Tito itself, which he adopted in the mid-1930s, was just one of many pseudonyms he used, though it became his permanent identity and the name by which history would know him. During the 1920s, a decade of instability, economic crisis, and political violence in Yugoslavia, Tito consolidated his reputation as a tireless organizer and pragmatic ideologist who understood both theory and practice, both the importance of maintaining ideological purity and the necessity of tactical flexibility. He was known for his ability to analyze situations clearly, to make quick decisions, to inspire loyalty among his comrades, and to maintain operational security even under intense police pressure. In 1928, in a move that would test his commitment and strengthen his revolutionary credentials, he was arrested in Zagreb for his participation in organizing a major strike that had paralyzed industrial production and for possession of subversive literature deemed dangerous by the authorities. The police had been tracking him for months, and his arrest was presented as a major victory in the struggle against communist subversion. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 5 years in prison, then transferred to Lepoglava Penitentiary, a harsh facility where political prisoners were held under difficult conditions designed to break their spirit. Far from breaking him, however, prison became for him a veritable political school where he came into contact with other veteran communists, many of whom had been involved in revolutionary activities since before the First World War, and who possessed deep knowledge of Marxist theory, revolutionary history, and organizational practices. The prison environment, paradoxically, provided him with time for intensive study, rigorous political debates, and the exchange of experiences with fellow prisoners that would have been impossible in the hectic pace of clandestine organizing on the outside. He read voraciously, working through classic texts of Marxism-Leninism, studying the history of revolutions, analyzing the strategies and tactics of revolutionary movements in different countries, and discussing these ideas endlessly with his comrades. During his incarceration, he engaged in what amounted to a postgraduate education in revolutionary politics, emerging from prison in 1934 more determined, better educated, and better prepared than ever to assume leadership responsibilities within the Communist Party. The years in prison had tempered him, hardened his resolve, and deepened his understanding of what would be required to make a revolution in Yugoslavia. After his release from prison in 1934, a period when Europe was descending into economic depression and political extremism, Josip Broz began to occupy increasingly strategic positions within the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, which had been operating clandestinely since its prohibition in 1921 and had been severely weakened by years of repression. The party leadership was fragmented, weakened by successive waves of arrests and police infiltration, and struggling with the difficulty of maintaining effective internal coordination across the various Yugoslav territories with their different ethnic compositions and varying levels of industrialization. In 1934, Broz became a member of the Central Committee, the party's highest decision-making body, and received the crucial task of restructuring the urban and rural cells of the party, with special emphasis on industrial zones such as Zagreb and Ljubljana, where the working class was most concentrated and militant. This was an enormous challenge requiring organizational skills, political acumen, and the ability to rebuild trust and networks that had been shattered by years of repression. His reports directed to the Communist International, the Moscow-based organization that coordinated communist parties worldwide, began to stand out for their practical approach, clear analysis of conditions in Yugoslavia, and his demonstrated capacity to reorganize dispersed bases and rebuild party infrastructure, despite constant police surveillance and the ever-present danger of arrest. He showed a remarkable talent for conspiratorial organization, creating secure communication channels that minimized the risk of interception, establishing protocols for underground work that significantly improved the party's resilience against state repression, and training new cadres in the arts of clandestine activity. Between 1935 and 1936, in a move that would prove crucial to his rise to leadership, Broz was sent to the Soviet Union for an extended period of political training and direct contact with the leadership of the Comintern, the international organization of communist parties under Soviet direction. This was considered a great honor and indicated that he was being groomed for higher leadership positions. In Moscow, he attended courses at the International Lenin School, where communist cadres from around the world studied Marxist-Leninist theory, revolutionary strategy, and party organization. During his stay in the Soviet capital, he lived through the terrifying times of the Great Purges, orchestrated by Joseph Stalin, a period when paranoia about enemies and saboteurs reached hysterical levels and hundreds of thousands of people were arrested, tortured into confessing to imaginary crimes, and executed or sent to labor camps. The purges particularly affected foreign communists living in the Soviet Union, who were easy targets for accusations of being spies or agents of foreign powers. Numerous Yugoslav militants were arrested during this period, interrogated by the NKVD, and in many cases executed as alleged enemies of the people and traitors to the communist cause. Among the victims was Milan Gorkic, who was then the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, and who disappeared into the machinery of Soviet repression, never to be seen again. Gorkic's fate, like that of so many others, was sealed in the basement of Lubyanka prison, and his name would be erased from official party histories. Broz managed to maintain a distance from internal factional disputes that might have made him suspect, and he adopted a discreet posture that allowed him to survive this extremely dangerous period when saying the wrong thing or associating with the wrong people could mean death. His ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Stalinist politics without becoming a victim himself demonstrated his political acumen, his survival instincts, and his capacity to maintain his composure under extreme pressure. He learned valuable lessons about the ruthlessness of political power and the importance of eliminating potential rivals and threats. With the fall of Gorkic and the elimination of other potential leaders who had been purged, the Comintern designated Broz as the principal representative of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, a decision that was formalized in 1937 when he effectively became the leader of the Yugoslav communists. This appointment was made in Moscow and handed down as a directive, reflecting the hierarchical nature of the international communist movement and the dominance of the Soviet Union within it. Upon resuming his activities in Yugoslavia with his new authority as party leader, Broz focused intensively on standardizing the structure of the Communist Party, establishing a cellular network with strict compartmentalization designed to resist police infiltration and repression. He understood that the party's survival depended on maintaining strict security protocols and ensuring that if one cell was compromised, it could not lead to the destruction of the entire organization. He created more active provincial committees that could make decisions and take initiatives without constantly having to refer matters to the central leadership, expanded the participation of women and ethnic minorities in party activities to broaden the party's base and appeal, and encouraged the widespread use of pseudonyms as a security measure to protect activists from identification and arrest. It was during this period that he began consistently using the pseudonym Tito, which would become his permanent identity and eventually his name in history, though the origins of this particular alias remain somewhat mysterious. The party began distributing newspapers and pamphlets focused on economic, social and national issues, adapting its discourse to local realities rather than simply repeating abstract Marxist formulas that meant little to ordinary people struggling with concrete problems. This pragmatic approach, which emphasized addressing people's immediate concerns while connecting them to broader revolutionary goals, made communist ideas more accessible and relevant to ordinary Yugoslavs struggling with poverty, unemployment, ethnic discrimination and political repression. Broz also established links with other communist parties in the Balkans and Central Europe, facilitating logistical support, information exchange, and coordination of activities that strengthened the international communist movement in the region. He traveled secretly to meetings with other party leaders, shared experiences and tactics, and worked to build networks that could survive repression and support each other in times of crisis. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia adopted as one of its priorities the fight against the growing authoritarianism and fascism across the continent, remaining vigilant regarding the advance of fascist movements in Italy and Germany, which posed an existential threat not only to communists, but to democracy itself and to the working class more broadly. The party analyzed the rise of Mussolini and Hitler, studied their tactics and the social conditions that had enabled them to seize power, and warned about the dangers of fascism spreading to Yugoslavia. The party's discourse was strategically reoriented to include the defense of national sovereignty and the struggle against imperialism, which helped broaden its acceptance among workers and nationalist intellectuals who might not otherwise have been attracted to communist ideology, but who shared concerns about foreign domination and the loss of independence. By framing communism in terms of national liberation and resistance to foreign imperialism, rather than just class struggle, Tito made the party more appealing to a broader spectrum of the population. By 1938, on the eve of the Second World War, the party had established active nuclei in all the principal regions of Yugoslavia, operating under centralized coordination that made it significantly more effective than it had been in previous years when it had been fragmented and weakened. Broz Taus, though still operating under various aliases and maintaining strict secrecy about his activities, was recognized internally as an effective coordinator and key figure in the communist reorganization, preparing the groundwork for what would become a mass movement during the coming war. The party was still relatively small, numbering only a few thousand committed members, but it was well organized, disciplined, and prepared to seize opportunities when they arose. The invasion of Yugoslavia by Nazi Germany in April 1941 was a catastrophic event that provoked the rapid disintegration of the Royal Yugoslav Army and the fragmentation of the territory among Axis powers and collaborationist governments that would rule with extreme brutality. The invasion, which began on April 6th with massive aerial bombardments of Belgrade and other cities, was swift, devastating, and overwhelming, utilizing the blitzkrieg tactics of rapid armored thrusts and air support that had proven so effective elsewhere in Europe against opponents who were unprepared for this new style of warfare. The Royal Yugoslav Army, despite having nearly 1.5 million men under arms, collapsed within 11 days in the face of simultaneous attacks from Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria. The army was poorly equipped, inadequately trained, riddled with ethnic tensions that undermined cohesion, and led by officers who had no idea how to respond to the German blitzkrieg. Units disintegrated, officers fled, and soldiers deserted by the tens of thousands, many simply wanting to return home to protect their families. The monarchy, King Peter II and his government, fled into exile first to Greece and then to London, abandoning the country to occupation and leaving a power vacuum that various forces would attempt to fill. The country was occupied and partitioned among Axis forces, Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria, each carving out zones of control and exploitation, while puppet governments were established to provide a veneer of local authority. In the midst of this institutional collapse and national humiliation, with the state apparatus destroyed and no legitimate authority remaining, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, led by Tito, was one of the first organizations to mount an armed response to the occupation. In July of that same year, after initially maintaining a cautious stance while assessing the situation, the party issued a national call to resistance that would give birth to the Yugoslav partisan movement, one of the most significant and effective resistance forces in occupied Europe. This call to arms represented a momentous decision, committing the party to armed struggle that would either result in revolutionary victory or complete destruction. The party proclaimed that it was the duty of all patriotic Yugoslavs to resist the occupation, to fight the fascist invaders, and to work for a new Yugoslavia that would be democratic, federal, and socialist. The partisans initially structured themselves as small guerrilla groups operating in rural and mountainous areas where they could hide from superior enemy forces with extremely limited resources, but employing tactics of mobility, surprise, and rapid attacks that confounded and frustrated the occupiers. Unlike traditional armies that sought to hold territory and fight set-piece battles, these groups combined military action with political agitation and local propaganda, seeking not just to harass the enemy, but to win the population to their cause and build alternative structures of power. Among their fighters were workers who brought discipline and political consciousness, peasants who provided knowledge of the terrain and local support, students and intellectuals who provided education and propaganda skills, and deserters from the former Royal Army who brought military training and experience. This created a truly popular force that transcended class boundaries and ethnic divisions, united by commitment to resistance and to the vision of a new Yugoslavia. The Communists established popular committees in the liberated zones, areas that they had cleared of Axis forces and were able to hold for extended periods, with the objective of creating administrative structures parallel to the Axis occupation. These committees provided governance, organized production and distribution of food, established schools and literacy programs, administered justice, recruited fighters, and demonstrated that an alternative to both the monarchy and fascism was possible. They represented the new Yugoslavia in embryo, showing people what liberation would mean in practice. The movement grew with remarkable rapidity during the first year of occupation, propelled both by the brutality of the occupying forces who implemented harsh measures against civilians, including mass executions, hostage-taking, and destruction of villages, and by the divisions within the resistance itself, which prevented unity against the common enemy. While the partisans defended a unified and socialist Yugoslavia that would guarantee equality for all ethnic groups and reject the ethnic nationalism that had poisoned Yugoslav politics, the Chetniks, Serbian monarchist forces led by Draža Mihailović, sought to restore the monarchy and establish Serbian dominance over the other Yugoslav peoples. The Chetniks, who initially received support from the British as the official resistance movement recognized by the government in exile, increasingly prioritized fighting the partisans over fighting the Axis occupiers. In many cases, Chetnik units collaborated openly with German and Italian forces against the partisans, prioritizing their ethnic nationalist agenda and their determination to prevent a communist takeover over the liberation of the country from foreign occupation. This collaboration, which would eventually lead the Allies to withdraw their support, created a complex three-way civil war in which Axis forces, partisans, and Chetniks all fought each other. Adding to this horrifically complex situation was the collaborationist Croatian regime of the Ustaše, a fascist movement led by Ante Pavelić and supported by the Nazis and Italians, which established the independent state of Croatia as an Axis puppet state. The Ustaše carried out systematic campaigns of extermination against Serbs, Jews, and Roma populations with a brutality that shocked even some German observers. The Ustaše established concentration camps such as Jasenovac, Stara Gradiška, and Gospić, where tens of thousands of men, women, and children were murdered in conditions of horrific brutality using methods that included shooting, beating, throat-cutting, and other forms of torture. This genocide created deep traumas and hatreds that would echo through Yugoslav history for generations, poisoning relations between Croats and Serbs, and creating wounds that Tito would struggle to heal through his policy of brotherhood and unity. The scale of Ustaše atrocities, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, radicalized the Serbian population and drove many into the arms of either the Chetniks or the partisans, depending on their political orientation. By 1942, after a year of intense fighting, loss, and learning, the partisan movement had consolidated zones of stable control with their own administrative structures and armies organized by regions with thousands of dedicated fighters. The partisans had transformed themselves from scattered guerrilla bands conducting hit-and-run raids into something approaching a regular army capable of holding territory and fighting sustained campaigns, with tens of thousands of fighters organized into brigades and divisions, possessing regional commands and staff structures, yet maintaining centralized control under Tito's unquestioned leadership from his headquarters, which moved frequently to avoid capture. The partisan army demonstrated remarkable resilience, surviving multiple German offensives specifically designed to destroy them, including major operations such as Fall Weiss and Fall Schwarz that deployed tens of thousands of Axis troops with air support and heavy weapons against partisan strongholds. These offensives inflicted terrible casualties and forced the partisans into desperate retreats through mountains in winter. But they failed to destroy the movement, which always managed to regroup, recover, and rebuild stronger than before. From 1943 onward, following the Tehran Conference in November where Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin met to coordinate Allied grand strategy for the remainder of the war, the Western Allies began to officially recognize the partisans as the principal resistance force in Yugoslavia, making the momentous decision to withdraw support from the Chetniks, whose collaboration with the Axis had become too blatant to ignore. British military missions were sent to partisan headquarters, including officers such as Fitzroy MacLean, who would write detailed reports on the effectiveness of the partisan movement and the character of Tito. Supplies including weapons, ammunition, explosives, medical supplies, and equipment began flowing to Tito's forces, though never in the quantities provided to resistance movements in Western Europe, and always less than what the partisans desperately needed. British and American aircraft dropped supplies by parachute at night to partisan-controlled areas, and submarines brought material to islands and coastal areas under partisan control. This Allied support, while limited, significantly enhanced partisan military capabilities and gave international legitimacy to Tito's movement. With the advance of partisan forces, as they grew stronger and more capable of offensive operations, and the retreat of Axis troops as the tide of war turned decisively against Germany following defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, Yugoslavia was progressively liberated between 1944 and 1945 in a series of campaigns that drove the occupiers from Yugoslav soil. The entry into Belgrade, the capital, took place in October 1944, with limited support from the Red Army, which operated in specific sectors of the eastern frontier to assist in the liberation of the capital before moving on to Hungary and Austria. In the rest of the country, it was the partisans who carried out the majority of liberation operations, without the presence of significant foreign troops, a fact that would prove absolutely crucial to Yugoslavia's post-war independence and Tito's ability to resist Soviet domination. Unlike Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, which were liberated primarily by the Red Army and subsequently came under direct Soviet control, Yugoslavia liberated itself through its own forces, giving Tito a legitimacy and power base that Stalin could not easily override. This autonomous liberation distinguished Yugoslavia fundamentally from other Eastern European countries and helps explain why Tito was able to successfully defy Stalin in 1948, when other Eastern European leaders who attempted resistance were quickly overthrown or forced to submit. The partisan army numbered over 800,000 fighters by the end of the war, making it one of the largest resistance forces in Europe, and it had proven its capability through years of brutal combat against German, Italian, Hungarian, Bulgarian, Chetnik, and Ustashi forces. During the final months of the war and immediately afterward, the partisans implemented a parallel administrative network that they had been building throughout the liberated territories, which consolidated rapidly after the German capitulation in May 1945 ended the war in Europe. The royal government in exile, which had spent the war in London issuing proclamations and hoping for restoration, was dissolved through an agreement with the Allies, despite British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's preferences for maintaining the monarchy as a bulwark against communism. A provisional government was formed under communist leadership with Tito at its head, and in November of that same year, elections were held that resulted in an overwhelming victory for the communist-led Popular Front, partly because of genuine popular support, but also because the elections were not entirely free and opposition parties faced intimidation. A plebiscite formally abolished the monarchy, with official results showing over 90% support, and proclaimed the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. Tito assumed the positions of Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, concentrating the principal levers of power in the hands of the Communist Party, which now controlled the state apparatus, the military, the security forces, and the economy. The consolidation of the new regime was accompanied by a series of sweeping structural reforms designed to transform Yugoslav society fundamentally and eliminate the old ruling classes, properties belonging to the nobility who had dominated society for centuries, the church which had been a major landowner, and the collaborationist bourgeoisie who had supported or profited from the Axis occupation were nationalized without compensation. A process of land redistribution was initiated to benefit landless peasants, fulfilling promises the partisans had made during the war. The new government created popular tribunals to judge war crimes and collaboration with the enemy. Tribunals which operated with little regard for due process, and which resulted in thousands of convictions and summary executions that eliminated potential opposition and sent a clear message about the consequences of resistance to the new order. Estimates of the number executed range from tens of thousands to over 100,000 Bur, with victims including Ustaše, Chetniks, captured German and Italian soldiers, clergy, former politicians, and others deemed enemies of the people. The state security apparatus was reinforced with the creation of UDB, the Administration of State Security, a secret police force responsible for eliminating internal resistance and monitoring potential threats to the regime. UDBA operated both within Yugoslavia and abroad, tracking émigrés and dissidents who might threaten the new order from exile, conducting surveillance, infiltrating opposition groups, and when necessary carrying out assassinations of those deemed particularly dangerous. Its methods were often brutal, including torture and extrajudicial killings, and it became one of the most effective and feared intelligence services in Eastern Europe. Tito utilized the military victory and the enormous prestige he had gained as the leader of the resistance as political capital to accelerate the centralization of power in party hands, moving quickly to consolidate control before opposition could organize. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia was reorganized following the Leninist model of democratic centralism, promoting hierarchical control in which decisions flowed from the top down, and cultivating an extensive personality cult around the leader that portrayed Tito as the father of the nation, the savior of the peoples, and the embodiment of Yugoslavia itself. Party congresses were held periodically to legitimize decisions that had already been made by the top leadership, providing a democratic facade for what was essentially authoritarian rule. Key positions throughout the government, military, economy, and society were occupied by former partisan commanders whose loyalty to Tito was unquestioned and who owed their positions to him. Simultaneously, an extensive propaganda system was implemented that exalted the partisan resistance, celebrated the liberation as the greatest achievement in Yugoslav history, and elevated Tito's figure as the symbol of national unity, liberation, and the promise of a socialist future. In 1948, a year that would prove to be a watershed in Yugoslav history and in the history of international communism, the relationship between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union collapsed after a series of escalating tensions related to political autonomy, economic strategy, and the fundamental question of whether Yugoslavia would be a sovereign state or a Soviet satellite. The Soviet leadership, headed by Josip Stalin, who was at the height of his power, and accustomed to absolute obedience from other communist leaders, expected Yugoslavia to subordinate itself completely to the interests of the Eastern Bloc, just as other socialist countries, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, had done without question. Stalin assumed that Yugoslavia, despite its independent liberation that had given it more autonomy than other Eastern European states, would ultimately follow Soviet directives in foreign policy, economic planning, internal political organization, and all other matters of importance. He viewed the communist world as a hierarchical system with Moscow at the center, issuing directions that other parties were obligated to follow without debate. He particularly expected Tito to consult Moscow before making important decisions and to accept Soviet advisors in all key positions. Tito, however, who had risked his life leading the partisan struggle and who commanded genuine popular support as the liberator of Yugoslavia, firmly rejected pressures to align his foreign policy and economic model with Soviet directives, insisting on Yugoslavia's right to determine its own path to socialism based on its own conditions and experiences. He was willing to maintain friendly relations with the Soviet Union and to coordinate on many issues, but he refused to accept that Moscow had the right to dictate to Yugoslavia or to interfere in its internal affairs. Tensions had been building for months over various issues, including Yugoslav plans for a Balkan federation that would unite Yugoslavia with Bulgaria and Albania, Soviet demands for joint companies that would give the USSR control over key sectors of the Yugoslav economy, the presence of Soviet agents within the Yugoslav military and security services who reported to Moscow rather than to Belgrade, and Yugoslav foreign policy initiatives that had not been cleared with Stalin. The Soviets also objected to the speed of collectivization in Yugoslavia and to various other policies. The breaking point came when the Cominform, the international organization of communist parties that had been established in 1947 as a successor to the dissolved Comintern to coordinate the communist movement under Soviet leadership, announced Yugoslavia's expulsion in June 1948. The resolution announcing the expulsion accused the Yugoslav government of ideological deviation, nationalism, hostile attitudes toward the Soviet Union, abandoning Marxism-Leninism, and betrayal of internationalism. The resolution called on healthy elements within the Yugoslav Party to overthrow Tito's leadership and return Yugoslavia to the socialist camp. Tito's response was immediate, defiant, and carefully calculated. The Yugoslav government condemned external interference and reaffirmed its political independence in the strongest terms, initiating a process of redefining its socialist doctrine to distinguish it clearly from the Soviet model and justify Yugoslavia's independent path. Unlike other East European communist leaders who depended on the Red Army for their existence and who had no choice but to submit to Soviet demands or face removal, Tito had come to power through an indigenous armed resistance that had broad popular support, which gave him substantially greater autonomy, domestic legitimacy, and the military forces to resist Soviet pressure. The Yugoslav leadership calculated that Stalin would not risk an invasion given the potential costs. The difficulty of occupying such mountainous terrain against a population experienced in guerrilla warfare, and the international complications that would arise. This calculation proved correct, though there were several years of acute danger during which invasion seemed possible, and Stalin certainly considered it, ultimately deciding that the risks were too great. The break with Moscow had significant and far-reaching internal consequences. Extensive purges were promoted against pro-Soviet militants, and anyone suspected of being a potential fifth columnist for Stalin who might support the Soviet position or attempt to overthrow Tito from within. Thousands of party members were expelled, interrogated, and in many cases imprisoned on charges of Cominformism, or support for Stalin against Tito. The security apparatus was strengthened dramatically to guard against Soviet sabotage, assassination attempts, and infiltration. The prison camp on Goli Otok Island in the Adriatic was created specifically to detain those suspected of sympathizing with Stalinism, advocating for Yugoslavia's return to the Soviet fold, or expressing any doubt about Tito's break with Moscow. Conditions in this camp were harsh and brutal, designed to break prisoners physically and psychologically through hard labor, isolation, beatings, and forced public confessions and denunciations. Thousands of political prisoners were held there under circumstances that were little better than concentration camps, demonstrating that Tito's regime, while independent of Moscow, remained thoroughly authoritarian in nature and willing to use extreme measures against perceived threats. The crisis of 1948 marked a fundamental strategic reorientation of the Yugoslav model, forcing it to distinguish itself ideologically from Soviet socialism and to develop theoretical justifications for its independent path. The leadership began to center its ideology on the concept of workers' self-management, a proposal that broke decisively with Soviet centralism and proposed that productive units, including factories, farms, and cooperatives, be managed directly by workers, councils elected from among the employees, rather than by state-appointed managers following directives from central planning agencies. This idea, first implemented experimentally in 1950 and then expanded throughout the economy, sought to decentralize economic power and construct a more participatory form of socialism that would overcome the bureaucratic ossification and alienation of Soviet-style socialism, while maintaining socialist ownership of the means of production and preventing the restoration of capitalism. In theory, self-management represented a revolutionary innovation that promised to fulfill Marx's vision of workers controlling their own labor and the products of that labor, avoiding both capitalist exploitation and Soviet bureaucratic control. The Yugoslav theorists, particularly Edvard Kardelj and Milovan Djilas, developed elaborate theoretical justifications for self-management, arguing that the Soviet Union had degenerated into state capitalism with a new ruling class of bureaucrats, while Yugoslavia was pursuing the authentic path to socialism through direct workers' control. In practice, the implementation of self-management was uneven and often failed to deliver genuine worker control, as enterprise directors and party officials frequently maintained effective control despite the formal existence of workers' councils. But it served as an important ideological distinction that separated Yugoslav socialism from the Soviet model and attracted considerable interest from socialists and leftists worldwide who were disillusioned with Stalinism and seeking alternatives. In the diplomatic sphere, facing Soviet hostility and the possibility of invasion or subversion, Yugoslavia approached Western countries seeking support without abandoning its socialist identity or allying with capitalism, walking a delicate tightrope between East and West. The government signed economic aid agreements with the United States and other Western European countries, especially between 1950 and 1953, when the threat from the Soviet Union seemed most acute, receiving substantial financial assistance, food aid, and even military equipment in exchange for guarantees of military non-alignment and resistance to Soviet expansion. Yugoslavia became a beneficiary of hundreds of millions of dollars in American aid, a remarkable situation for a communist state whose leader had been denouncing American imperialism just a few years earlier. This aid was crucial for Yugoslavia's survival during the difficult years after the break, when the Soviet bloc imposed an economic blockade, cutting off trade and forcing Yugoslavia to reorient its economy westward. The United States and Britain provided this support, not because they liked communism, but because they saw Tito's defiance of Stalin as creating a crack in the monolithic appearance of the communist bloc, and as serving Western strategic interests by tying down Soviet resources. Yugoslav foreign policy began to prioritize national sovereignty above all else, non-intervention in the internal affairs of other states as a fundamental principle, and cooperation with countries of the so-called Third World that were emerging from colonialism and seeking to avoid domination by either superpower. This positioning, born initially out of necessity as Yugoslavia found itself isolated from both blocs, would eventually evolve into a comprehensive foreign policy doctrine and lead to Yugoslavia playing a founding role in the non-aligned movement that would reshape international politics. The new Yugoslavia that emerged from the war and revolution was structured as a federation composed of 6 republics: Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Macedonia, in addition to 2 autonomous provinces within Serbia: Kosovo with its Albanian majority and Vojvodina with its substantial Hungarian minority. This complex federal structure was designed to accommodate the country's extraordinary ethnic diversity and to prevent the domination of any single national group, particularly Serbian domination, which had characterized the interwar kingdom and had generated intense resentment among other Yugoslav peoples. Each republic possessed a certain degree of autonomy with its own parliament, government and administrative apparatus, its own cultural institutions, and control over certain aspects of economic policy, although all key decisions regarding defense, foreign policy, monetary policy, and overall economic planning remained under the control of the federal government in Belgrade and ultimately of the Communist Party, which maintained a monopoly on political power throughout the country. The party itself was organized federally with republican branches, but ultimate authority resided in the federal leadership controlled by Tito. Tito adopted as an official slogan and guiding principle the policy of brotherhood and unity, promoting vigorously the transcendence of local nationalisms, ethnic hatreds, and historical grievances in the name of socialist solidarity and a new Yugoslav identity that would supersede narrower ethnic identities. This was an enormously ambitious project given centuries of ethnic conflict, the recent traumas of the war including massacres and ethnic cleansing, and the deep-seated nature of ethnic identities and loyalties in the Balkans. Explicit manifestations of ethnic chauvinism were prohibited by law and severely punished, and state media disseminated constantly a narrative of peaceful coexistence among the different peoples of Yugoslavia, portraying ethnic harmony as both the greatest achievement of the socialist revolution and a sacred duty of all citizens. Historical events that might inflame ethnic tensions were carefully managed. The Ustaše genocide against Serbs, for example, was acknowledged but not excessively emphasized, while Serbian nationalist narratives of victimhood were suppressed as potentially destabilizing. The official language was standardized as Serbo-Croatian, an attempt to unify the similar but distinct Serbian and Croatian languages and to minimize linguistic differences that might reinforce ethnic divisions, although local variants continued to exist and were tolerated within limits. In practice, Serbo-Croatian functioned as a common language that most Yugoslavs could understand, facilitating communication and mobility across the country. The promotion of a Yugoslav identity and the suppression of ethnic nationalism were pursued through multiple means, including education, where school textbooks emphasized shared history, common struggles against foreign occupiers, and the brotherhood forged in the partisan struggle, rather than dwelling on ethnic differences or historical conflicts between Yugoslav peoples. Cultural policy promoted Yugoslav artists, writers, and intellectuals who emphasized themes of unity rather than those who focused on particular ethnic traditions. The education system taught children that they were Yugoslavs first and members of particular ethnic groups second. Young men from all republics and ethnic groups served together in the Yugoslav People's Army, which was deliberately organized to mix conscripts from different regions and ethnic backgrounds, creating bonds across ethnic lines and fostering Yugoslav rather than ethnic identities. Military service became a crucial institution for promoting Yugoslav identity. as hundreds of thousands of young men each year spent time in an environment that enforced ethnic mixing and punished ethnic prejudice. Major infrastructure projects employed workers from different regions and republics, and internal migration was actively encouraged to reduce ethnic homogeneity in particular areas and create more mixed communities where different ethnic groups would have to learn to live together. New industrial cities were built in underdeveloped regions, attracting workers from across Yugoslavia and creating more cosmopolitan environments. To prevent possible ruptures and ethnic conflicts that might tear the country apart, the government maintained constant and extensive internal surveillance through multiple overlapping security agencies. UDBA, the Yugoslav secret police, monitored vigilantly for any signs of separatist movements, both within the country and among the diaspora communities abroad, where nationalist émigrés maintained organizations and publications calling for the breakup of Yugoslavia. Any discourse or organization that questioned the integrity of the federation, that promoted ethnic nationalism, or that advocated for republican independence was considered a serious threat to the state and dealt with harshly through arrests, imprisonments, and sometimes extrajudicial killings. At the same time, Tito sought to co-opt local elites and give them a stake in the system's survival, ensuring proportional representation of different ethnic groups in administrative and military structures at both the republican and federal levels, which created a vested interest in the survival of the federation among regional leaders who enjoyed power and privileges under the system. A complex system of ethnic quotas and balancing ensured that no single ethnic group could dominate the federal institutions completely, though Serbs remained overrepresented in the military and security services. Despite the authoritarian character of the regime and the significant restrictions on political freedom, including the prohibition of opposition parties, the censorship of media, and the surveillance of citizens, internal stability was quite for decades one of the system's principal achievements and sources of legitimacy. In comparison with its neighbors in the Soviet bloc, where political repression was often more severe and arbitrary, Yugoslavia presented relatively lower levels of overt political repression and managed to avoid major internal conflicts during Tito's governance. The regime was certainly dictatorial, with real power concentrated in Tito's hands and the party apparatus, but it was not totalitarian in the manner of Stalin's Soviet Union, with its attempt to control every aspect of life and thought. Yugoslavia allowed somewhat greater personal freedoms than other communist states, including freedom of movement that permitted citizens to travel abroad, something nearly impossible for citizens of other communist states who were effectively prisoners within their own countries. Hundreds of thousands of Yugoslavs worked temporarily in Western Europe, particularly Germany, and could travel back and forth, an unthinkable situation in the Soviet bloc. Investments in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and social services were distributed among the different republics, and ambitious regional development programs sought to reduce economic inequalities between the more developed northern republics like Slovenia and Croatia and the poorer southern regions like Macedonia, Montenegro, and Kosovo. Large-scale projects including highways that connected all parts of the country, hydroelectric dams that provided power for industrial development, factories that created employment, and apartment blocks that provided modern housing were undertaken to modernize the country, raise living standards, and demonstrate the achievements of Yugoslav socialism to both domestic and international audiences. After the traumatic break with the Soviet Union in 1948 that left Yugoslavia isolated and threatened, Tito began constructing a foreign policy based on active neutrality and refusal to align with either superpower bloc donors, a policy that would define Yugoslavia's international position for decades and make it a model for other countries seeking to maintain independence during the Cold War. Yugoslavia did not align with either the Soviet bloc or the Western bloc, deliberately remaining outside military alliances such as the Warsaw Pact, which united the Soviet Union's Eastern European satellites, and NATO, which united the United States and its Western European allies. Yugoslav diplomacy, skillfully managed by Tito, who proved to be an astute international statesman, sought to strengthen national sovereignty and establish bilateral relations with countries around the world based on principles of non-interference in internal affairs, mutual respect regardless of ideological differences, and opposition to colonialism, imperialism, and domination by superpowers in all its forms. This principled neutrality, which came to be known as non-alignment, was not passive neutrality but active engagement in international affairs from an independent position. In 1956, Tito initiated a deliberate approach to leaders of other countries that were also seeking an independent path outside the major power blocs and resisting pressure to choose sides in the Cold War. Among these leaders were Jawaharlal Nehru of India, a key figure in the post-colonial world who had led India to independence and was committed to maintaining its sovereignty and avoiding Cold War entanglements, and Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, who had challenged Western dominance through the nationalization of the Suez Canal and was pursuing Arab nationalism and socialism. The dialogue among these three leaders, who met initially in 1956 on the Yugoslav island of Brioni, evolved toward the idea of an informal alliance of countries committed to self-determination, peace, decolonization, and cooperation among developing nations that refused to become pawns in the Cold War chess game between the superpowers. They shared the conviction that the bipolar division of the world into two hostile blocs was dangerous, that it restricted the sovereignty and options of smaller nations, and that an alternative approach was both necessary and possible. In 1961, the founding conference of the non-aligned movement was held in Belgrade with great fanfare, with the participation of 25 states representing Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe, a truly global gathering that demonstrated the breadth of support for the non-alignment concept. This conference marked the formal establishment of a movement that would eventually grow to include more than 100 countries, making it one of the largest international organizations after the United Nations, and giving voice to nations that felt marginalized and ignored in a world dominated by superpower rivalry. For Yugoslavia, hosting this conference was a moment of enormous prestige that confirmed Tito's status as a world statesman whose influence extended far beyond the Balkans and who was recognized as a leader among nations struggling for independence and development. The conference was extensively covered by international media, and Tito's role as host and co-founder gave Yugoslavia visibility and influence disproportionate to its size and economic weight. The non-aligned movement promoted principles of peaceful coexistence between nations, regardless of their social systems, vigorous opposition to colonialism and neo-colonialism in all forms, support for national liberation movements fighting for independence, advocacy for a more equitable international economic order that would benefit developing countries rather than just the wealthy nations of the North, and resistance to the formation of military blocs and the division of the world into spheres of influence. Yugoslavia used its leadership role in the movement, with Tito recognized as one of the movement's founding fathers, along with Nehru and Nasser, to secure economic and political relationships with countries across the developing world that provided markets and sources of raw materials, and to maintain its independence by building relationships with so many countries that neither superpower could easily isolate or pressure it. Tito became a frequent mediator in international disputes, offering Belgrade as neutral ground for negotiations, and a spokesman for the interests of smaller nations against superpower domination at the United Nations and other international forums. During the 1960s, Yugoslavia experienced significant economic growth and rising living standards that improved life for millions of citizens and created what appeared to be a successful model of socialist development that avoided both the stagnation and repression of Soviet-style communism and the inequalities and instabilities of capitalism. Growth rates were high, new industries were developed, unemployment declined, wages rose, and consumer goods became more available than in other communist countries. To sustain ambitious investments in industry, infrastructure, social services, and military modernization necessary to defend the country's independence, the government resorted to external financing on a large scale and pragmatically joined institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, an exceptional situation among socialist regimes that typically rejected these Western-dominated financial institutions as instruments of capitalist imperialism. This integration into the international financial system reflected Yugoslavia's unique position between East and West and its willingness to be pragmatic rather than ideological in economic policy. The Yugoslav economy benefited substantially from remittances sent home by hundreds of thousands of Yugoslav workers who were employed in West Germany, Austria, and other Western European countries under guest worker programs that allowed them to work abroad for periods of years. These remittances, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars annually, bolstered foreign currency reserves, maintained elevated domestic consumption even when domestic production faltered, and allowed for an accelerated pace of construction of major public works, including the highway system that connected all parts of the country. Massive apartment blocks that provided modern housing for the growing urban population, factories that created employment and produced goods for domestic consumption and export, and cultural facilities that enhanced quality of life. The combination of socialist planning with market elements, workers, self-management, international integration, and ideological flexibility created a hybrid economic system that defied easy categorization and seemed for a time to offer a viable third way between Soviet central planning and Western capitalism. Yugoslav economists developed theories of market socialism that attempted to combine the efficiency of market mechanisms with socialist ownership and control, and these ideas attracted considerable international interest. However, beneath the surface of apparent success, the growing volume of foreign loans and the increasing integration into the global capitalist economy began to expose the Yugoslav economy to external shocks and create vulnerabilities that would become painfully apparent in the following decades. The debt was manageable as long as economic growth continued at high rates, and Western creditors remained willing to provide new loans to roll over old debts. But this situation created a dependency that contradicted the rhetoric of self-reliance and autonomy and stored up problems for the future. Already by the beginning of the 1970s, significant regional economic inequalities were becoming increasingly apparent and politically problematic. Tourism on the Adriatic coast emerged as a key source of foreign currency, especially benefiting Slovenia and Croatia, which possessed most of the attractive coastline, and which also benefited from their proximity to Western European markets, their relatively advanced infrastructure, and their historical ties to Central Europe. Coastal cities, towns and islands were developed as tourist destinations, attracting millions of visitors annually from West Germany, Austria, Italy, and other Western European countries who brought desperately needed hard currency. Slovenia and Croatia, the most developed republics, increasingly resembled Central European countries in their living standards, economic structures, and cultural orientations, while republics such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and especially Macedonia and Kosovo faced persistent economic stagnation. High unemployment that left large numbers of young people without prospects, and structural deficiencies in infrastructure, education, and healthcare that regional development funds and transfer payments could not adequately address despite considerable expenditures. Economic decentralization, which had been promoted as part of the self-management system and which gave republics and enterprises considerable autonomy in economic decision-making, made implementation of effective redistributive policies increasingly difficult because wealthier republics resisted what they saw as subsidizing the poorer regions while receiving nothing in return. Bureaucracy grew without effective central control, as each republic, enterprise, and municipality created its own administrative structures, leading to duplication, inefficiency, and opportunities for corruption. In many cases, self-management transformed from an idealistic vision of worker control into a facade for clientelistic networks and corruption as enterprise directors and local party officials enriched themselves, made decisions based on political connections rather than economic rationality, and used their positions to distribute favors and build power bases, while workers had little real power despite the formal existence of workers' councils. The gap between the wealthier northern republics and the poorer southern regions continued to widen despite official policies aimed at promoting balanced development, creating resentments and tensions that had dangerous political implications for the future of the Federation. By the late 1970s, the combination of these mounting problems, persistent and growing regional inequalities that contradicted the promise of socialist development, external debt exceeding $20 billion that consumed an increasing share of export earnings just to service and uncontrolled inflation that reached double digits and eroded living standards, plunged the country into a profound economic crisis. Basic consumer goods became scarce as production faltered and imports were restricted to conserve foreign currency. The deceleration of economic growth after decades of rapid expansion eroded confidence in the Yugoslav socialist model and raised fundamental questions about its viability. And social tensions began to surface as workers struck for higher wages and various groups blamed others for the economic problems, anticipating the conflicts that would intensify dramatically in the following decade after Tito's death, removed the one figure who could hold the system together through personal authority. During his final years in the 1970s, as he entered his 80s, Tito continued exercising absolute control over the state and maintaining his position as the supreme authority despite his advanced age and recurring health problems that increasingly limited his activities. The Constitution of 1974, the fourth Yugoslav constitution and the most complex, consecrated him as president for life of Yugoslavia, formally enshrining what had long been reality and consolidating his role as the central figure of the federation around whom everything revolved, and ensuring that he would remain in power until his death. This constitutional provision was unprecedented in communist states and reflected Tito's unique position and the system's dependence on him. Although in his final years he participated less in day-to-day operational decisions, delegating more to subordinates and spending more time at his residences, his personal prestige, accumulated over decades, maintained in equilibrium a political system that was increasingly fragmented beneath the surface by ethnic tensions, economic difficulties, and generational changes. The state apparatus, the party structure, and the entire Yugoslav system depended to a great extent on the symbolic authority that he continued to represent as the father of the nation, the liberator, the embodiment of Yugoslav unity, and the guarantee against both ethnic conflict and external threats, even with physical limitations that restricted his mobility and energy, including difficulty walking and periodic serious illnesses. Tito continued fulfilling international agendas when his health permitted and attending meetings of the non-aligned movement, where his presence remained highly valued, and where he was treated as an elder statesman and one of the movement's founding fathers. His trips abroad, though less frequent than in earlier decades, were extensively covered by official media as demonstrations of Yugoslavia's prestige and diplomatic autonomy, and as reassurance that Tito remained active and in control. In the internal sphere, he maintained his role as the ultimate mediator among the republics, whose relations were becoming increasingly strained, the unquestioned leader of the Communist Party, whose authority no one dared challenge openly, and the symbol of Yugoslav unity, whose presence alone kept centrifugal forces in check. Any serious dispute or crisis, whether between republics, between party factions, or between different policy approaches, was ultimately resolved or at least contained by his intervention and by the authority he had accumulated over more than 4 decades of undisputed leadership. In 1979, Tito began suffering serious circulatory complications related to diabetes and atherosclerosis, and severe infections that led to gangrene, necessitating the amputation of his left leg. A traumatic medical intervention for a man of his age that signaled his physical decline was irreversible. He was hospitalized in Ljubljana, Slovenia, in the University Medical Center, where the best doctors in Yugoslavia worked desperately to save him, and his health condition became a subject of intense national concern, international attention, and speculation about what would happen to Yugoslavia after his death. The controlled press issued daily medical bulletins, reporting on his condition in carefully managed language that sought to be truthful enough to maintain credibility while avoiding causing panic. And authorities attempted to project an image of institutional continuity and stability, emphasizing that the system would continue functioning regardless of what happened to any individual, even Tito. However, everyone knew that this was largely wishful thinking, and that Yugoslavia without Tito would be profoundly different and potentially unstable. Despite receiving the best medical care available in Yugoslavia and consultations with foreign specialists, his condition continued to deteriorate over several months as multiple organ systems began failing. Tito died on May 4, 1980, just 3 days before his 88th birthday, at 3:05 in the afternoon, bringing to an end a historical cycle of more than 40 years at the helm of the country and closing a chapter in Yugoslav and European history. His death marked not just the passing of an extraordinary individual, but the end of an entire era, and it created uncertainty about Yugoslavia's future that would prove entirely justified. The question of what would happen to Yugoslavia without Tito, the post-Tito problem, had been discussed privately and anxiously for years among the political elite, but despite extensive discussions and constitutional provisions for collective leadership, no adequate preparation had been made for the succession because Tito's personal authority was unique and could not be transferred or replicated through institutional mechanisms. The system that he had created and held together was fundamentally dependent on his personal prestige and authority. The funeral of Tito was one of the largest state funerals of the 20th century, comparable to those of Churchill, Kennedy, and Stalin, with official delegations from more than 120 countries, including heads of state and government from across the world, demonstrating the extraordinary international prestige he had accumulated. Among the attendees were figures as politically diverse as Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, representing the Communist East, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, representing the capitalist West, Cuban leader Fidel Castro, PLO chairman Yasser Arafat, and numerous African and Asian heads of state from the non-aligned movement. The ceremony in Belgrade was followed by millions of people worldwide through television coverage and represented a rare moment of international convergence in the midst of the Cold War, demonstrating the unique position that Tito and Yugoslavia had occupied in international affairs as a bridge between East and West, as a leader of the non-aligned nations, and as a symbol of the possibility of charting an independent course in a bipolar world. The massive international attendance and the expressions of genuine respect from leaders of opposing camps testified to Tito's remarkable achievements as a statesman and his success in maintaining Yugoslavia's independence and relevance on the world stage. The trajectory of Josip Broz Tito raises profound and uncomfortable questions that remain without definitive answers decades after his death, questions that continue to be debated by historians, political scientists, and citizens of the former Yugoslav republics. Did Yugoslavia exist because of Tito, his vision, his authority, and his ability to hold together diverse and potentially antagonistic peoples, or did it exist merely in spite of him, with his authoritarian rule and suppression of national aspirations creating resentments that would eventually explode after his death? Would it have been possible to maintain united such an extraordinarily diverse federation, bringing together South Slavic peoples with different historical experiences, religions, levels of economic development, and national aspirations, without the symbolic weight of his unique figure as the partisan leader who had liberated the country and who embodied the promise of a better future? Could any institutional framework, no matter how carefully designed, have survived the nationalist tensions, economic disparities, and historical grievances that had plagued the Balkans for centuries? Or was that imposed stability merely a lid forcibly held down on a pressure cooker of ethnic nationalism and economic resentment that was always ready to explode, with the apparent success of Yugoslav unity masking fundamental contradictions and tensions that would inevitably surface once the strong hand that had suppressed them was removed? These questions have profound implications, not just for understanding Yugoslav history, but for thinking about multi-ethnic states, the role of charismatic leadership, and the possibilities and limits of holding together diverse populations in a single political framework. Was Tito a visionary who secured decades of peace, stability, and rising living standards in a historically conflictive region that had been devastated by wars and ethnic violence, creating a model of ethnic coexistence and non-aligned foreign policy that offered hope and inspiration to people worldwide? Or was he fundamentally an authoritarian leader who simply postponed the inevitable collapse through repression and personal authority, suppressing rather than resolving the underlying conflicts that would eventually tear Yugoslavia apart in the horrific wars of the 1990s? Was the Yugoslav experiment in self-management socialism, non-alignment and multi-ethnic federation a genuine and valuable attempt at creating a socialist alternative to both Soviet communism with its bureaucratic centralization and Western capitalism with its inequalities and exploitation? An experiment that offered important lessons, even if it ultimately failed? Or was it an unsustainable construct held together only by charisma, coercion, foreign loans, and the unique circumstances of the Cold War, doomed to collapse once any of these supporting elements were removed? Could any leader or institutional framework have prevented the nationalist resurgence that followed Tito's death? Or was the disintegration of Yugoslavia inevitable regardless of the particular circumstances, the result of historical forces and ethnic antagonisms too deep to be overcome by any political system? These questions continue to resonate today as scholars and citizens debate Tito's legacy and Yugoslavia's history. Tito's legacy remains deeply contested and interpreted differently depending on perspective, ideology, and nationality. For some, particularly those who experienced the prosperity and stability of Yugoslavia in its better years and who remember the sense of pride in belonging to a significant non-aligned country, he remains a hero who liberated the country from fascism, stood up to Stalin, maintained independence from both superpowers, and created decades of peace and progress. For others, particularly nationalists from various Yugoslav peoples who emphasize their own group's suffering, he was a dictator who suppressed legitimate national aspirations, imprisoned political opponents, and created an artificial state that could not survive his death. The question remains deeply relevant today as we consider the continuing challenges of maintaining multi-ethnic states in the Balkans and elsewhere, the role that strongman leaders play in holding together diverse societies, the risks and benefits of authoritarian stability versus democratic instability, and the possibilities for cooperation among different ethnic and religious groups. Tito's Yugoslavia, for all its flaws and ultimate failure, represented an extended period during which South Slavic peoples lived together in relative peace, an achievement that should not be dismissed lightly given the terrible violence that preceded and followed that period.